Welcome to my channel, Vibes of Life. In today's video, we're going to explore something most people never even think about, something that could be the very reason you've been stuck in the same emotional pain, mental exhaustion, or spiritual numbness for years. You've tried therapy, prayer, meditation, journaling, but nothing seems to truly set you free. And here's the hard truth. It might not be you. It might be something else, something darker, something that doesn't want you to heal. Now, this isn't the kind of story that begins with fireworks or loud warnings. In fact, it starts in the quiet. The kind of silence that creeps into your life when you're alone in your room, lying awake at 2 a.m., wondering why you still feel broken after all this time, why certain thoughts keep returning, why you feel drained after talking to certain people, or like you're walking around with invisible chains around your chest. And yet, no one sees them but you. It's in that silence where this one spirit hides. This story is inspired by the timeless insights of C.S. Lewis, the brilliant mind who once wrote that the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he doesn't exist. But Lewis wasn't just speaking of demons in red suits. No, he was warning us about subtle forces, spirits that don't scream or attack, but whisper, spirits that distort truth just enough to make us believe lies like, "You'll never get better," or "You're too damaged to heal." And the most dangerous of these is the one we're exposing today. A spirit so common, so quietly toxic, that most people never realize it's feeding on their pain, the spirit of resentment. You've met it before, haven't you? It usually disguises itself as justified anger. Maybe someone hurt you deeply, a betrayal, a childhood wound, a toxic relationship. And at first, holding on to that anger feels like strength, like a shield. But over time, that same emotion turns in on you. It poisons your joy. It rewrites your memories, and slowly it blocks every path to healing. That's when the spirit takes root. In this story, you'll meet Daniel, a man who believed he had moved on from his past, only to find himself haunted by shadows he couldn't explain. He was successful on the outside, driven, respected. But inside, there was a coldness that never left. Relationships would break without warning. His dreams always seemed just out of reach, and no matter how hard he tried to grow spiritually, something, or someone, was always standing in the way. One night, after a strange dream and a chance discovery in an old bookshop, Daniel finds a long-lost manuscript written by a forgotten Christian mystic. What he reads changes everything. It points to a very specific presence in his life, an evil spirit that has blended so deeply into his habits and thoughts, he never saw it coming. The manuscript gives him a choice, but also a warning. And just when Daniel decides to confront this hidden enemy, something unexpected happens, something that makes him question everything he thought he knew about healing, about faith, and even about himself. What did he find? And what did the spirit do when it realized it had been discovered? Stay with me. This story is just beginning. Daniel wasn't the kind of man who believed in spirits. Not really. He believed in logic, strategy, discipline. He had built his life like a fortress. Everything had its place. Every emotion had a lid, and vulnerability was something you left at the door. But ever since he read that manuscript, something inside him had shifted. He couldn't explain it, but he felt like something was watching him. No, not watching, following him. The words from the book echoed in his mind. The spirit hides where bitterness festers. It feeds on the unspoken. He tried to shake it off, chalk it up to imagination, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The manuscript had been strange from the start. Written in worn ink on crumbling parchment, it had no title, no author, just page after page of deeply personal reflections that felt more like confessions than teachings. The writer spoke of an evil spirit that attaches itself to people through past wounds, not through possession or some dramatic haunting, but through thoughts, patterns, and emotional wounds that never healed. The kind of pain people bury, the kind they carry in silence for years. Daniel found himself reading it every night, long after he should have been asleep. Each page seemed to know him. It described his past with eerie accuracy, moments he had forgotten or forced himself to forget. The silent anger he still held toward his father, the betrayal by an old friend, the guilt he buried after walking away from someone who needed him. It was all there, as if the spirit had been chronicling his life alongside him. And then the dreams started. He would wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, unable to remember what he had seen, only that it had felt real. Sometimes he'd hear a voice in the dream whispering the same question over and over. Are you ready to let go? But Daniel didn't know what it meant. Let go of what? His pain, his past, and even if he wanted to, how? In the waking hours, strange things began happening. The lights in his apartment would flicker without reason. Conversations with people he trusted would suddenly turn tense, like someone or something was trying to isolate him. His phone would ring, and no one would be there. Each day it became harder to focus, harder to pray, harder to feel anything at all. But the final push came when Daniel visited his mother's old house, the place where everything began. What he found there left him cold. Something had been waiting for him, and it had finally decided to make itself known. The moment Daniel stepped into his mother's old house, the air felt different, heavy, like it hadn't been breathed in for years. Dust hung in the sunlight, pouring through the half-open blinds, and the silence was sharp, almost painful. This was where the spirit had first taken hold, though he didn't realize it back then. He remembered the fights, the long silences, the cold distance that grew between them after his father left. As a boy, he had mistaken survival for strength, pushing his feelings so far down they became invisible even to him. But now, as he stood in that living room, it all came rushing back. The manuscript said the evil spirit gains power through emotional wounds left unattended. Resentment, guilt, grief, these are its entry points. Daniel had all three, and he wasn't the only one. Across the city, people he barely knew were starting to cross his path again. Old friends, co-workers, even strangers, each carrying their own invisible burdens. And strangely, they all spoke of feeling stuck, of dreams that ended in silence, of a weight they couldn't name. The more Daniel paid attention, the more he realized this spirit wasn't just after him. It was everywhere, quiet, hidden, feeding. One subplot began to take shape when Daniel reconnected with Rachel, a woman he hadn't seen in over a decade. She had once been close to him before everything fell apart. She too had scars, ones that mirrored his own. And as they talked, Daniel noticed something in her eyes. Fear. She had seen it too, felt it, and it was growing stronger. But the more they uncovered, the more dangerous it became. The manuscript had warned them, once the spirit is named, it fights to survive. And now, it knew they were looking for it. The days blurred together after that. Daniel and Rachel found themselves pulled deeper into the mystery, drawn to places they hadn't visited in years. Abandoned churches, forgotten journal entries, strange symbols carved into wood or hidden in old photographs. Every clue they uncovered felt like a step closer to something ancient, something that didn't want to be found. The spirit wasn't just a force in their lives anymore. It was beginning to push back. Daniel could feel it, through sleepless nights, sudden bursts of rage, and a growing pressure behind his eyes, like something was watching from just behind the veil. Rachel had dreams too, more vivid now. She would wake up shaking, claiming she heard voices calling her by name, sometimes from behind closed doors that didn't exist. One night, she stood outside her apartment and couldn't bring herself to go in. "It's waiting inside," she whispered. They both knew the spirit had become aware. It had lived in their memories, in their pain, in everything they thought they had left behind. But now, it was active, and it was angry. Then came the letter. No return address, just one sentence scrawled in red ink. "You brought the light too close." Inside was a torn page from the original manuscript, one that Daniel had never seen before. It spoke of a ritual not of exorcism, but of confrontation, not to drive the spirit out, but to expose it. But doing so came with a price. As the tension built, so did the fear. Their conversations turned shorter, the silence between them heavier. They knew the final confrontation was near, but they weren't sure if they were strong enough to face it. And worse, they weren't sure what would be left of them if they did. The next morning, Daniel woke to find Rachel gone. Her phone was still on the kitchen counter, screen cracked, buzzing endlessly with missed calls. No note, no warning, just silence. For a moment he wondered if the spirit had gotten to her, if she'd been taken somehow. But then he found something strange. Her journal. She never left it behind. Inside were frantic entries, written in shaky handwriting. The last page read, "The spirit doesn't only feed on pain, it divides, it isolates. I think it's using me to get to Daniel. I have to stop it before it's too late." Daniel's heart raced. It all made sense now. The fear, the distance growing between them, the strange arguments that started for no reason. The spirit had shifted its tactic. It wasn't just haunting them, it was trying to turn them against each other. And if Rachel was right, it had already begun. Desperate, Daniel retraced their steps, hoping for some clue. When he reached the old chapel they had visited days earlier, he noticed something he hadn't before. A section of the wall had collapsed, revealing a staircase leading underground. Dust and cobwebs clung to the air as he descended, but there was something deeper, something heavy in his chest he couldn't explain. At the bottom, he found what looked like a forgotten prayer room, its walls scorched and covered in faint markings. In the center lay another piece of the manuscript, but this one wasn't written by the original author. It was Rachel's handwriting. She had continued the writings, and the message was chilling. "There's not just one spirit, there are three. Resentment was only the first." Daniel stood frozen, pulse pounding. If that was true, then everything they had uncovered so far. It was only the beginning. And worse, Rachel might have gone after the second one alone. That meant she was in more danger than either of them had realized. The stakes had changed. It wasn't just about removing a single evil spirit to find healing. It was about surviving long enough to face what was still hidden. And if resentment was only the first, then the others were already at work, feeding on fear, twisting love, distorting truth. Daniel looked around the dark room, heart heavy with a single thought. What if he was already too late? Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed Rachel's journal page and climbed out of the chapel, driving through the night with no clear direction, only instinct and the growing weight in his chest. He followed the trail she'd left behind, piecing together her last steps from memory and notes she had scattered in the margins of the manuscript. Everything pointed to a remote house deep in the forest, where she once mentioned seeing visions in her dreams. He had never believed her before. Now he was terrified she'd gone alone. When he arrived, the house looked abandoned, its windows dark, door ajar. Inside, the air was freezing and thick with silence. He moved slowly through the rooms until he found her. In the attic, standing perfectly still, her back turned to him. The moment he called her name, she spoke without moving. "It's not just resentment," she said quietly. "It's also fear and control. They've always been with us." Her voice sounded like her, but there was something underneath. Daniel stepped closer, and she finally turned. Her eyes weren't her own. The spirit had taken hold. But instead of running or breaking down, Daniel reached into his coat and pulled out the manuscript. He began to read, slowly, steadily, the words the original author had written in the final section, the part Daniel had only found hours earlier. It wasn't a ritual. It wasn't a prayer. It was a choice. To forgive, to release control, to confront fear not with power, but with surrender. As the words filled the air, Rachel screamed, not in pain, but as if something inside her was being torn away. A gust of wind blew through the attic, and the room pulsed with pressure. Then, silence. Rachel collapsed into his arms, sobbing, eyes clear. It was over, or so they thought. As they left the house, the final twist came. In Daniel's coat pocket, where the manuscript had been, there was now only a single scrap of paper, one sentence, written in new ink. "Now that you've seen us, you can never unsee." The spirit was gone, but the door had been opened. The healing had started, but something else was now watching, and it was waiting. Weeks passed, and the silence finally felt peaceful again. Daniel and Rachel returned to their daily lives, though everything looked different now. The heaviness that had once lived in Daniel's chest, the old wounds, the silent anger, the guilt he carried, was lighter, not gone completely, but no longer in control. Healing wasn't a moment. It was a choice, one that had to be made again and again, and this time he was ready. Rachel, too, had changed. She no longer feared the dreams. Instead, she kept writing, her journal now filled with reflections, not warnings. She said something Daniel would never forget. The spirit fed on the parts of us we tried to hide. But when we named it, when we faced it, it lost its power. And maybe that was the real lesson. Not everything evil looks like a monster. Sometimes it shows up as our own thoughts, as the pain we refuse to feel, as control disguised as safety. But healing begins when we stop hiding. They never found the manuscript again. It vanished, like it had only existed for that moment in time. But the note it left behind, "Now that you've seen us, you can never unsee," still haunted them, not in fear, but as a quiet reminder. Evil spirits like resentment, fear and control don't scream for attention. They wait, and if you let them, they'll quietly steal your peace, your clarity, your future. But if you shine a light on them, if you choose healing over hiding, they lose their grip. Daniel eventually returned to his mother's house one last time. He stood in the living room, the same place where it all began, and closed his eyes. For the first time, he didn't feel the past pulling him back. He whispered a prayer, not for protection, but for release. Then he turned and walked out, leaving the door open behind him. And maybe that's what healing really looks like, not erasing the past, but walking forward, even with the memory. Because once you've faced the spirit blocking your healing, you realize it was never stronger than your will to be free. Thank you for watching this story on Vibes of Life. If this spoke to you, you're not alone. Healing is real, and sometimes it starts by naming what's been hiding in the dark.